Good morning. This year, this month, marks the 40th anniversary of diplomatic relations between the United States and China. We have come a long way since ping pong. Welcome to Made in China 2025, the Policy Behind the Rhetoric. We have speakers joining us today from Berlin to share a brand new report from Merix about the policy's global impact, from Washington to talk about trade, from Hong Kong to share new data on semiconductors, and from Beijing to share the historical context of this policy. We'll also dive into artificial intelligence, intellectual property, and the perceptions and realities of the US-China relationship. We can't cover it all today, so join us, stay with us, keep up to date with our emails, because we'll be programming heavily on this topic. Next up for us on February 27th, we're going to do a deep dive into China's automotive industry, and we'll be doing much more. I'm Margaret Conley, representing Asia Society Northern California, and our aim is to bridge understanding between Asia and the US. And we're very busy now with lots to cover. And with that comes responsibility to get the narrative right, to offer a platform for all viewpoints, and we need your help with that today. I'd like to welcome our honorary chairs, George Schultz and Jack Wadsworth, board members Rob Cox, Mark Levine, Sheila Melvin, Yabo Lin, and Andy Tao. We have representatives from consulates here, from China, from Korea, from Singapore. They'll all be in the room today. Welcome Consul General Park, Consul General Lau, Consul Xiao Qi, and Vice Consul Zhang. We had lunch yesterday with consul generals from 8 Asian nations. This policy is not only a US-China issue, it's a global one, and we'll be covering it. We have friends here from C100, from the Rhodium Group, and from PPI as well. Thank you to Stanford University for hosting us, to Chunmei Zhao for helping us secure this beautiful room. Our team and our staff, would you guys please raise your hands? These guys have been working very hard to make this happen. Chris Hirano, Matt Rowett, Melissa LaBeouf, Alex Kwok, thank you guys for making this happen. Special shout out to Matt. Thank you also for our volunteers, to our volunteers and interns. Everyone's wearing a blue lanyard, so if you have any questions or you want to sign up for membership, you can talk to any of these folks. A few housekeeping items. Please take a moment to silence your phones. While you have them out, make sure you have our event app. It shows the latest schedules. You have details of everyone's speaker bios. You can ask questions in the app. You can upload photos. You can connect with each other. And if you have any issues, you can go to that table in the back room and we can help you download it. We do want to hear from you throughout the day. We do want to incorporate Q&A as often as we can. We're going to have 2 mics in the room to help answer your questions. And a reminder that this event is on the record. We are recording in the back, and we do have press in the room. So let's get started. First up, our very own Asia Society Policy Institute Vice President, Wendy Cutler. She's joining us from Washington. Please join me in welcoming Wendy.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's truly a pleasure and honor for me to be here. And thanks to Margaret, my Asia Society colleague, who's doing an incredible job in the North California office. I'm going to be kicking off this event today. I'll be the first to admit, I don't really know a lot about technology. There are a lot of technology people in the audience. I'm a trade person, so I'm going to be talking about trade and hopefully kind of putting the broader context of the discussions we'll have during the day on Made in China 2025 in perspective. Today's event couldn't take place at a timelier moment against a backdrop of really strained and tense relations between the 2 largest economies in the world. And the news coming out of Beijing and Washington on our relationship is coming so quickly that I've learned in any remarks I do now, I make sure that I check my iPhone before I speak to make sure there's no breaking news or something new hasn't happened. We say in Washington every day almost feels like a month of news, and so every week just seems so long. I note just yesterday, China released its trade statistics for 2018. The United States will be releasing its own statistics in a couple of weeks. There are differences in the value of the numbers reported, but I would just underscore that China's statistics did uncover, and I think a number of trends, but they also surprised analysts. The numbers for December indicated that Chinese imports fell by 7.6%, the biggest decline since 2016, revealing serious weakness in its economy. And its exports fell by 4.4%, and this, from what I understand, was not expected by the analysts. And probably some of this has to do with the tariff escalation that we're seeing, and also efforts by companies to kind of front-load their sales before further tariffs might come into effect. Also, China reported the largest annual trade deficit with the United States in many years, up 17.2%. And I just underscore this because, as many of you know, our president is very focused on bilateral trade deficits, and one of his objectives in our trade policies with many countries, including China, is to lower that deficit. So I think that statistic is going to complicate the trade negotiations, which already have enough complications as well. Just last week, a U.S. delegation at the vice ministerial level came back from Beijing. These were the first, what we call face-to-face, in-person meetings between both sides since President Xi and President Trump met in Argentina and agreed kind of on this 90-day truce period where they agreed not to impose further tariffs and also to allow a 90-day time frame for trying to reach a negotiated solution on the range of trade and related issues facing both countries. And later this month, there's an expectation that the lead Chinese negotiator and the senior economic advisor to President Xi, Li He, will be visiting the United States. And what's looming here is this March 1 deadline. It's about 6 weeks away. And in short, if a trade deal is not reached by then, the president has indicated that he's prepared on March 2nd to proceed with further tariff escalation. And at the same time, the administration is going forward with a new export control regime, focused on restricting exports of critical technologies, and it's also implementing its pilot program, restricting investments under the revised CFIUS legislation. And there's talk of further sanctions on Huawei, additional Justice Department actions on cyber theft, possible restrictions on visas, universities, labs, and other people-to-people exchanges. So there's a lot to talk about, and frankly, almost too much. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to focus my remarks on the trade negotiations. In many respects, the trade talks now will really set the tone and direction of other facets of our bilateral relationship with China going forward. These negotiations are not only being watched closely in Beijing and in Washington, they're really being closely monitored through the region and throughout the global economy, because what happens between the two largest economies in the world has effects both on regional and economic growth and global economic growth as well. Today's program will be focusing on one aspect of the trade talks, the Made in China 2025 program. And in many ways, that program is kind of what I would call the poster child of many of the trade issues that the United States has with China at this point. It includes issues such as subsidies, discrimination, market access restrictions, production and export targets, and level playing concerns, and also IPR concerns. And I'll let the other speakers today really delve into the details there, and I really look forward to the report that will be issued, that will be described by our colleague from Berlin, who I know has done a lot of excellent work on this topic. So I thought over the next 10 to 15 minutes, I would focus on 4 questions. The first is, how did we get here? Where do things stand? What are the prospects for a U.S.-China trade deal? And where are we headed in our overall bilateral economic relationship? So in terms of how we got here, that could take a 3-hour speech. I'm going to save you. I'm going to kind of give you the highlights, and I'd like to just highlight 7 factors. And there's a lot of this is just based on my experience working at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative during these years. Number 1, the WTO. And I think that when China joined the WTO in 2001, there were 2 expectations, and these expectations, unfortunately, were not met. The first was that China was going to continue to reform. In joining the WTO, it undertook an incredible transformation of its economy. It passed thousands of laws and regulations to open its economy and to reform its economy. And the mood and the feeling was that this was on a trajectory. It was irreversible. And in fact, the reform trend would continue as China became an integral part of the WTO. And that kind of didn't happen. The second expectation was that the WTO would continue to be a negotiating forum. So rules would continue to be updated once China joined, and also tariffs would continue to be reduced, including Chinese tariffs, and that also did not happen. Around the same time that China joined the WTO, the Doha round of trade negotiations was launched, basically never reached completion, and at least from the US perspective, those talks are dead. So we have, I think, those 2 factors contributing to where we are today. We've also seen China becoming more confident, less reform-oriented, and going forward with more industrial policies and seeking to promote its own indigenous innovation. And here I would just point to the 2007 financial crisis, where I think China became really emboldened because all of a sudden it felt that not only was it helping the global economy recover, but that maybe its state-led model had a lot more going for it than the model the United States followed that got us into that crisis. Third, the U.S. Followed many approaches during that year to China to deal with the range of economic and trade issues. But I think that the conclusion has been that while these approaches made some incremental progress on the trade front and maybe more meaningful progress on currency and some macroeconomic issues, they really didn't deal with the structural issues, and so we are where we are today. Fourth, the U.S. business community, underwent a real transformation. They were real advocates of the U.S.-China trading relationship. But over time, we've seen the U.S. business community become increasingly disillusioned and frustrated with China and the types of restrictions that they are facing in the Chinese market. And with respect to reform, while there was some early hope when Xi Jinping became president that he would go forward with these reforms that were outlined in the third plenum, within a year or 2, it became evident that those reforms were not going to be his priority. 6, I would say that China misread the United States. It did not see the growing frustration with China in the United States and the growing consensus among the U.S. business community, the U.S. administration, U.S. Congress about China. When the Trump administration came in many ways it reverted to its old playbook, trying to buy off the administration with increased promises of increased purchases of soybeans and LNG. And it also tried to rally U.S. companies to kind of make its case to the administration, frankly, with little avail. But also the Trump administration, I believe, has misread China in many respects, and maybe as a result, and this is something we can discuss later in this conference, it's become kind of overconfident about what it could get China to do under pressure. So the second question, the current state of play. We have 90 days, and if you count those 90 days, I think today we can say we're about halfway through those 90 days. I believe it's the 14th, so give or take a day. So that means there's 6 weeks left for this trade negotiation. And I can tell you as a former trade negotiator, there's a lot of work to do. We also are in a world where we have substantial tariffs in place. The United States has placed tariffs on about $250 billion worth of Chinese imports into the United States, and China has imposed about $110 billion of tariffs on U.S. imports into China. Both sides are hurting from these tariffs. China, which is already experiencing domestic economic challenges, including high debt, economic slowdown, manufacturing contraction, decline in consumer confidence, and now declining exports, is feeling the tariffs. The tariffs are exacerbating the kind of economic challenges that they are facing. But the U.S. is also hurting too. Yesterday the president spoke to the American Farm Bureau, and one of their key concerns are the Chinese tariffs against U.S. exports, agricultural exports to China. Our businesses are hurting that rely on inputs and machinery from China, and as a result, their workers are hurting too. And our consumers are beginning to feel the pinch as well, not to mention the overall shroud of uncertainty, which is having its effects on the market. So with this backdrop, our negotiators from both sides came together in Beijing last week, and they did make some progress. But it's one thing to say in a trade negotiation that you're making progress. Progress is good, but progress is no guarantee of a successful conclusion of the negotiation. Take it from me. I think what has led to some of the goodwill at the negotiating table last week is that we saw over the past month or so a series of Chinese announcements and actions that it's implemented to try and address some of the U.S. concerns, including buying more U.S. soybeans and LNG, temporarily reducing the Chinese tariff against U.S. auto imports, stepping up penalties against IPR violators, publishing a nationwide investment negative list, issuing draft new investment law, which includes language to ban forced technology transfers, something I'm sure we'll be talking about later. And also, China at the end of last year made an announcement that it plans to revamp its Made in China 2025 program. Now, I have to admit, when I heard that, I did call Margaret and said, maybe you want to change the name of the conference. But I think, as our colleague from Berlin will tell us later, that maybe this is not so much a revamping as it might be a rebranding. The negotiators are focused on what we call 4 buckets of issues. The first I would call the shopping list, and that just means China agrees to buy more, whether it be soybeans, LNG, or other products. Second would be the market access bucket, and that includes dealing with tariffs and non-tariff measures to services, goods, and investment. The third bucket is probably one of the most difficult, bucket of issues to deal with, and of key concern and priority to the lead negotiator, Ambassador Lighthizer, and that is seeking structural changes in the Chinese economy, including stepped-up intellectual property enforcement and protection, dealing with forced technology transfer, dealing with excessive subsidization, dealing with the behavior of state-owned enterprises, and dealing with overcapacity. And in addition to those 3 buckets, there's the bucket of what I would call enforcement mechanisms. And this is going to be a very critical part of the negotiations, because there is a history in these negotiations, and this isn't just with China, that countries in trade negotiations make a lot of promises, but sometimes there's not a lot of follow-through. And I think with China through the years, we've seen some great pledges, but maybe not enough follow-through. No surprise that the structural and the enforcement issues are going to probably be the most difficult to deal with. So, next question, what are the prospects for a deal? I would say the good news is that both sides do have a shared interest in finding a negotiated solution. And I think a lot of that has to do with both economies are hurting, and we can debate who's hurting more by the threat of increased tariff escalation. But that's very different to say that they want a deal at any price. China, for example, has what we call in the trade world red lines beyond which it can't go. So, for example, China is not going, as a result of these negotiations, to become a market-based economy. I don't see it agreeing to eliminate its industrial policies, and I don't see it to committing to getting rid of all of its subsidies. But the question is, how far is it willing to go in these areas to try and address U.S. concerns? And for the United States, the Trump administration has been very public about its priorities for the talks, and it will be judged against these priorities. At a minimum, it will need to show that the deal addresses these structural issues, including, as I mentioned before, IPR and forced technology transfer. And it will also need to show that this deal is better than the deal that previous administrations have concluded. I think there are three key challenges facing the negotiators over the next 6 weeks. Number one is coming to some accommodation on this range of structural issues. Second, we'll be trying to come up with enforcement mechanisms to make sure that both sides agree to monitor and enforce the results of the agreement to make sure they're having the intended consequences in the marketplace. And third, and here people aren't really talking about it, but I think it's important to keep in mind, what is China going to want from these negotiations? And in all my negotiating experience with China, China also has had demands. And here, let's just say in the negotiations I was involved in, China was always asking us to relax our investment restrictions or to relax our export control regimes. That's not going to happen. Neither of these are going to happen. If anything, the United States is going in a different direction. So the question is, what will they ask? Will they ask that the existing tariffs be lifted? Will they ask for some kind of accommodation on Huawei, a la what happened with ZTE? We'll have to see, but I think this is going to be a challenge. There are three kind of key outcomes. One is kind of the breakup option that come March 1, talks aren't going anywhere, don't have a deal. March 2nd, we go ahead and we continue with our tariff escalation. The second would be the breakthrough scenario where the US and China announce a comprehensive trade deal and all tariffs are lifted. And the third is, no guess, and I mean, no surprise where I kind of come out, there'll probably be some kind of partial breakthrough. And that means there'll be some immediate deliverables and actions that will be announced, but there'll be an agreement to continue talks on the enforcement mechanisms and structural issues. However, the current tariffs that are in place, the $250 billion I mentioned and the $110 billion, would largely stay in place except for some exceptions. And so anyway, that's where I'm coming from here, and I'm sure people will want to challenge that in the Q&A period. But let me just conclude by saying, what does all this mean, and where are we going? And just some thoughts. I mean, in my view, we are in a new world in our relationship with China. Even if we reach a trade deal, things aren't going to go back to where they were. It's a world where we're going to see more confrontation and competition, and frankly, less cooperation. I would underscore, this all didn't start with President Trump. There were growing concerns during the Obama administration about where this relationship was headed, and there was growing concerns by our Congress and our business community as well. But President Trump has taken this to a new level. By using tariffs as a tool to pressure China, he's chosen a path that I can say was considered but rejected by his predecessors. The problem with imposing tariffs, number one, you're breaking international WTO trading rules, and therefore you're opening the door for your trading partners to do the same. And second, as we're seeing, with respect to, just given the interconnectivity between all our economies now, It's very hard to impose tariffs against another country without shooting yourselves in the foot and affecting your own workers, your own companies, your own consumers. But President Trump, I can say with no surprise, has certainly gotten China's attention. The key question will be over the next 6 weeks over the Trump administration is how far is the president prepared to go during his presidency in redefining the U.S.-China relationship. So far, the answer has been quite far. But I think the important data point will be on March 1. And here, will the president pocket the outcomes achieved so far with China and declare victory? And I've heard certain people say that, particularly if the president feels that he's facing other domestic challenges at home. Or second, will he extend the talks or even have his team leave the negotiating table and proceed with further tariff escalation on March 2nd? These are questions we'll all have to, we'll have a better sense in 6 weeks, but I'm sure we'll all be watching closely. I would just conclude by saying the trade aspect of the bilateral relationship is just one part of this overall kind of tense relationship, but it's become very high profile and high stakes are involved. And I believe it will be a bellwether of what we can expect over the next 2 years. And I'll be watching closely, and I'm sure you will be too. Thank you very much.
We have a few questions, time for a few questions here. Yes. We have mic runners, so hold on till a mic comes to you so we can get this on record. Thank you.
Hi, George Spader. I don't understand the comment that we joined WTO and there has been no reform. I mean, that, as somebody who's lived in China, including Hong Kong, for nearly 30 years, I think it's been an amazing process of reform, and it continues today. So it's incomprehensible to me that we have this myth in the U.S. that somehow China isn't changing. It's changing extremely rapidly.
Well, let me just clarify. I didn't say there's been no reform. What I said was there were expectations of reform that weren't met. And I couldn't agree with you more that China has continued to reform. However, for example, when you look at the pledges of reform made in the third plenum in 2013 about how President Xi was going to lead reforms in a whole range of areas, we really haven't seen those reforms. And now I'm going to put a plug in for an Asia Society Policy Institute tool that we have worked with the Rhodium Group to track the reforms from the 2013 pledges of the third plenum. And these are quarterly updates on our website, and they basically show, it's based on results in the marketplace and kind of key indicators. And in most areas where reform was pledged in 2013, we not only are not observing that reform, but there have been setbacks in reform.
Next question, James.
Hi, Wendy. James Green. Thanks so much for your nice overview. You had a lot of experience in your career at USTR dealing with Japan and industrial policy in Japan. Can you just share what that experience is like and how it compares or doesn't compare to China, and kind of what works at the negotiating table when you're trying to address some of these structural issues, and what lessons we can learn from that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Let me just share a few thoughts. First of all, I don't know where he is, but Daryl Hatano, who I worked with in 1991 on the U.S.-Japan semiconductor agreement, he's in the audience. We worked together over, many years ago, kind of on similar issues with Japan. And it was interesting, in the U.S.-Japan semiconductor agreement, we got to the point with Japan was that we didn't even know how to write the rules. And so what we basically said is, you figure out how to increase the U.S. involvement and participation in the semiconductor market, and we're going to put a number in the agreement of 20%. And we expect, I think it was within a year and a half, that 20% of all Japanese purchases of semiconductors would be from foreign companies. So that's what we call a managed trade approach. We tried these approaches with Japan, and frankly, while there was some success in the semiconductor area, one can argue if it was the managed trade approach or just kind of the trends in the industry. But I think we did, face a lot of challenges in negotiating with Japan through the years. Japan was viewed as one of our most formidable negotiating partners. When I first started at USTR, we had about 8 people working on Japan and 1 person working on China, if you can imagine that. Now, when you look at USTR, there are not only about 8 people working on China in the China office, but all other offices, agriculture, intellectual property, so many people are working on the relationship, and also James Green, who worked for USTR in Beijing. USTR opened their own office in our embassy in China. So, the lessons we learned were probably be patient, be creative, and, really push your trading partner, but also work with other like-minded countries to try and effect change. And I think that's an area where this administration probably has not done enough, and that is trying to enlist other allies, other trading partners to make the same case with us vis-a-vis China, because other countries share our concerns. Unfortunately, some of them also have their own bilateral trade rifts with the United States, I think, which is dampening their enthusiasm to work with this administration, vis-a-vis trying to write new rules and to press China to really reform its market and create a level playing field.
Any other questions? Stanley?
Hi, I'm Stan Kwong. The reason I want to ask the questions, you mentioned 3 points specifically in terms of why the U.S., in terms of the business community, the Congress, and also the president. How do you see the Section 301 that came out last year, that report comes in under that, in terms of even getting some of the American business input in terms of the 301 report?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. I'll just to share with you something. During my career at USTR, and this wasn't, this is not unique to China, but just a more general comment that a lot of businesses would come in and complain to us and say, fix our problem, but don't use our name and don't share with our trading partners the fact that we're having problems. There was a real fear of retribution. And so, some people ask me, well, why didn't USTR 10 years ago, when the first indigenous innovation program was announced by China, why didn't the U.S. right then, call a spade and, insist that China get rid of it? And, we worked very carefully with the business community then, trying to do it in a way where we could get the information from the business community, but we would protect their confidentiality. And frankly, sometimes that handicaps our negotiators at the table, because the other country will say, okay, you're talking in generalities. What's the real problem? Give me the evidence. We don't think this is happening. And so when our companies aren't willing to share that information, it's very difficult to achieve the kind of negotiated solution they're looking for. I do think, though, that the U.S. business community, as it's become kind of more concerned about trends in the Chinese market, and beginning to see that, maybe they were welcome with open arms 5, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that things in some sectors in particular are getting, it's getting a lot harder to operate. And as a result, I think that the U.S. business community now is becoming kind of more, I don't want to use the word cooperative, I don't know if that's the right word, but let's just say more forthcoming with the types of barriers and challenges that they're facing in the market. And with that information, I think the U.S. government trade negotiators are so much more effective.
We have time for one last question in the middle here.
Oh, great. Thank you. Appreciate your comments, Wendy. Right here.
Okay.
I just wondering, last week I noticed the USS McCampbell passing close to the Paracels. Will there be any effort to link these trade negotiations with the South China Sea? And number two, is there any potential resolution there?
Well, let me just take a step back and just answer that question more broadly. Up until the Trump administration, at least during my career working for both Republican and Democratic administrations, The security issues were really on a separate lane from the trade and economic issues. And part of the thinking was there, they both were important on their own merits. So the notion that you would be paying someone in the trade area if they did what you wanted them to do in the security area, although what we were asking them to do in a security area would be in their own interest anyway, just didn't make a lot of sense. I do think in the Trump administration, we are seeing a more transactional approach. And there are, times where the president has kind of conflated both less, I think, the South China Sea, but more North Korea, Chinese cooperation in North Korea, with trade. And so we're seeing that, at least statements made to that effect. But, my view is that these issues should kind of stay in their own lane. Of course, when you're doing any trade negotiation, you're always aware about what's going on in your overall relationship with the country. Of course you are, and you're having internal meetings and you're understanding what's going on in the other lane. But, the notion of trading one off for the other to get more in the security area and then as a result, tell our workers and farmers and businesses that, we're going to trade your interest off for something else. I think that's something that, maybe kind of a bridge too far for at least many of our stakeholders.
Wendy, thank you very much. Let's thank her. And Wendy, please come back again soon. Thank you.